When you go silent, something remarkable begins to happen. Not just within you, but within the space you leave behind. Most people think silence is passive, that it's about retreat, about withdrawal. But silence, when used with intention, becomes an active force. A force that speaks without sound. A force that penetrates the psyche of the one who no longer hears from you. And in that void, he starts to think. At first, it might not seem like much. Maybe he scrolls past your name, maybe he shrugs it off, maybe he tells himself you're just taking space. But the truth is, silence plants a seed. Not in the external world, but in his inner world. And what begins as a seed of uncertainty grows day by day into a full psychological experience. Because silence is not a disappearance, it's a mirror. And when the reflection he's used to, your words, your presence, your energy, is suddenly removed, he has no choice but to face himself. This is where it begins to unfold, the discomfort, the questioning, the subtle unraveling. You see, most people don't reflect unless they're disrupted. Familiarity breeds blindness. When someone is always available, their presence is taken as a given. But the moment you remove your energy from someone's field, you trigger a disruption in their nervous system. The regular input is gone. The certainty, the connection, the validation, it vanishes. And the human mind, in the absence of certainty, seeks meaning. So he starts asking questions. Not always consciously, not always immediately, but subconsciously, the mind begins to loop. Why isn't she reaching out? Did I do something? Is she moving on? Did she finally decide she deserves better? And now you've created space for internal dialogue. That's the opening. The ego begins to lose its grip because the ego relies on control, on feedback, on response, on attention to affirm its image. When you go silent, you cut that supply. And in the absence of external reinforcement, the ego starts to fracture. What once felt powerful now feels uncertain. And uncertainty is the beginning of self-inquiry. But let's go even deeper. Silence doesn't just remove your voice, it removes the buffer, the distractions, the justifications, the denial he's been using to protect himself from truth. Because while you were talking, while you were engaging, even in conflict, you were a distraction from the inner confrontation he was avoiding. Your silence pulls that away, and suddenly the inner noise becomes louder. The stories he told himself about who he was in the relationship or how much you needed him start to fall apart, and what takes their place is not comfort, it's vulnerability. This is why silence is so powerful. Not because it's cold, not because it's cruel, but because it removes illusion. It removes the illusion of control, the illusion of dominance, the illusion that you will always be available no matter how he shows up. And in that vacuum, he's left to feel the truth of his own behaviors. Not because you explained it to him, not because you debated him into awareness, but because your absence makes him confront what your presence allowed him to avoid. Now understand, this doesn't happen all at once. The mind doesn't flip like a switch. It shifts in layers. The first few days, he might distract himself, tell himself you're playing games. But as the silence stretches, the subconscious begins to work on him. Your voice is no longer heard, but it's still felt. Your energy echoes in his memory. Every moment where you were kind, where you were present, where you gave deeply, those moments replay, but this time there's no new input to override them, so they grow louder and more meaningful and more painful. You've changed the narrative simply by choosing not to speak. And the irony is, the more he tries to ignore your silence, the more it commands his attention. That's the paradox. Silence, when intentional, becomes magnetic. Not because it manipulates, but because it forces awareness. And awareness, in the right environment, leads to transformation. So if you're wondering whether he notices, whether it's working, whether your silence has any impact, understand this. He's not just thinking about you. He's feeling the consequence of how he treated you. Because your silence isn't empty, it's full of boundaries, of clarity, of evolution. It holds a vibration, one that says, I'm not here to beg for what I deserve, I'm here to become what I deserve. And that message, spoken in silence, echoes longer, louder, and deeper than any words ever could. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. In the beginning, he might not notice, or at least that's what it looks like on the surface. He carries on, business as usual. No messages from you? That's fine. He tells himself it's a phase. He rationalizes it, minimizes it. Why? Because his ego still believes it's in control. You see, control is a deeply embedded survival mechanism, especially when it comes to emotional relationships. When someone is used to your presence, your attention, your emotional availability, that familiarity becomes a form of power. Whether he was consciously aware of it or not, your energy validated his identity. He knew who he was in your eyes. And more importantly, he knew he could expect a certain response from you. That expectation became his foundation. It was predictable. It was secure, but then you went silent. And in that silence, something essential begins to shift. The ego, which thrives on consistency and control, is suddenly thrown into unfamiliar territory. No feedback, no validation, no emotional reassurance. At first, he might dismiss it, even act indifferent. But here's the truth. The ego cannot stand uncertainty for long. It starts to crack. This is where the real psychological unraveling begins. Day by day, your silence starts to dismantle the internal structure he's built around himself. He's no longer receiving the same cues that allowed him to feel superior, certain, or emotionally in control. Without your reactions, he's left in a kind of emotional limbo, and that limbo creates tension. That tension grows. Now, what's fascinating and deeply human is that we don't really start questioning ourselves when things are going well. We begin to question when the external environment no longer mirrors the story we've been telling ourselves. When he was in control of the dynamic, when he felt sure of your place in his world, he didn't have to think deeply. There was no friction. But silence is friction. It creates an internal conflict. If she's not responding, what does that mean? Did I misread her? Was I wrong? Am I still wanted? The ego hates those kinds of questions because they require self-examination. And self-examination means letting go of the illusion that one is always right, always in charge, always the prize. So what starts to surface is something far more vulnerable: doubt. And here's the powerful part. You didn't say anything to create this effect. You didn't argue, you didn't plead, you didn't explain. You simply stopped feeding the system. That's what cracks it. Because when a dynamic is built on control, removing participation doesn't just disrupt it, it dissolves it. The ego doesn't know how to handle silence. It's designed to work within reaction, to play a role in a script it believes it's writing. But when you remove yourself from that script, you change the entire storyline. Suddenly, he's left trying to read a page that hasn't been written yet. And the more he tries to predict your next move, the more uncertain he becomes. That uncertainty, that's where transformation begins. Now, let's go even deeper. In psychological terms, the human brain is wired to seek certainty because uncertainty is interpreted as a threat. So, when you become unpredictable, when you no longer respond, when your energy is no longer accessible, he enters a subtle stress state. He may not admit it, but physiologically, the nervous system is alert. It's scanning for clues, looking for patterns, trying to re-establish the old control. And when it can't find them, it starts to shift into introspection. That's the moment when the outer mask begins to fall. Suddenly, he's not thinking about winning, he's thinking about what went wrong. He's not strategizing anymore, he's questioning. And in that questioning, a more authentic layer of the self is accessed. The part that's unsure, the part that's been hiding behind bravado, the part that maybe deep down always feared you'd walk away the moment you remembered your worth. This is what your silence does. It doesn't just confuse, it exposes. It reveals the cracks in the ego's armor. And once they're exposed, they can't be unseen. He starts to realize he doesn't have as much power over the situation as he thought. And more than that, he begins to wonder if he ever did. This is where the true shift in dynamics happens, because the moment he recognizes he's no longer in control of your energy, he begins to feel the absence of it more profoundly. He might not say it, he might not show it, but the ego's grip is weakening, and beneath it, something far more honest is emerging. What used to be control is slowly replaced by reflection, by humility, by the awareness that your silence wasn't punishment, it was elevation. It was a recalibration of your self-worth. And that's when he starts to really think about what he lost. The moment he realizes your silence is not a reaction, but a decision, is the moment he begins to lose control and you begin to reclaim your power. Time has a fascinating way of reshaping memory, especially when someone goes silent. The mind, in the absence of new information, doesn't just stop, it starts to rewrite, to reframe, to reimagine. When you're no longer in his life in a tangible, physical way, when your energy, your presence, your attention are suddenly absent, his memory of you doesn't disappear, it intensifies. And here's the paradox: silence doesn't erase your impact, it amplifies it. You have to understand how the mind works. The human brain is a meaning-making machine. It needs stories. It needs reasons. And when you go quiet, when you step away from the noise and pull your energy back, you leave behind an unfinished narrative in his psyche, something unresolved. And the human brain hates the unresolved. It starts scanning the past to make sense of the present silence. And the more silence there is, the more effort the brain exerts to fill in the blanks. That's where idealization begins. In the early stages, he might brush it off. She's just trying to prove a point, or she's probably talking to someone else. But as the days stretch into weeks, the certainty begins to fade. And what enters the picture instead is curiosity. That curiosity quickly morphs into longing, and that longing becomes a distorted version of the past. Now, here's what most people don't realize. Memory is not objective. It's subjective, fluid, highly influenced by emotional states. And when you go silent, you trigger a very particular emotional cocktail. Hurt, loss, uncertainty, nostalgia. These are powerful forces. They strip away the layers of judgment he once had, the criticism, the rationalizations. Instead of seeing your flaws, he starts focusing on your presence, how it made him feel. He replays the laughter, the comfort, the way you looked at him, the way you listened. The details he once overlooked now seem golden. The things he found ordinary, he now sees as rare. This is the mechanism of psychological contrast. When something familiar is removed, its value increases in memory. This isn't fantasy, it's neuroscience. The dopamine response associated with connection doesn't just shut off when the connection ends. In fact, the brain often responds to the withdrawal by amplifying the reward system's memory of that connection. In simple terms, the good moments get brighter. The emotional highs get higher. You become larger in his mind than you ever were in the room. But here's the deeper part. This doesn't just affect how he remembers you, it affects how he sees himself in relation to you. In silence, he starts to reconstruct an image of who he was when you were present. And often that reflection is uncomfortable. He remembers what he said, what he didn't say, how he made you feel, or worse, how he didn't see you when you were right in front of him. And this is when regret begins to bloom. See, when you were there, when you were communicating, he could lean on your presence to soothe his own shortcomings. He could rationalize his behavior, downplay his lack of effort. But now, there's no more distraction. He's not comparing you to other people anymore. He's comparing his past self to the self you brought out in him. And that's not an easy comparison to sit with, because while you're evolving, growing, shifting in silence, he's stuck in a loop of memory and meaning. And the loop tightens with time. This is how your silence becomes transformative, not just for you, but for him. It creates a vacuum where his ego once ruled, and into that vacuum rushes the truth. Not only did he misjudge you, he misjudged the value of your presence, the grace of your energy, the privilege of being seen, really seen by someone who cared. It's important to understand that this isn't manipulation. You're not going silent to control him. You're going silent to heal yourself, to protect your peace. But the ripple effect of that silence is unavoidable and perhaps even necessary, because without the echo of your absence, he might never recognize the depth of your presence. So day by day, thought by thought, the memory of you begins to outshine the noise that once distracted him. He doesn't just miss you. He starts to yearn for the version of himself that existed when you were in his life. And that yearning, that's the beginning of awakening. It may come with denial, with resistance, but it's happening nonetheless. And you didn't have to do anything but to hold your center. The mind can deny what's in front of it, but it can't escape the weight of memory. And in your silence, you become unforgettable, not because you stayed, but because you walked away with grace. There's a moment, often quiet and unnoticed, when his emotional walls begin to tremble. It doesn't happen with fireworks or some grand epiphany. It unfolds slowly, almost invisibly, and ironically it begins when you stop trying to get through to him, when your voice no longer echoes in his daily life, when your presence no longer softens the corners of his world. The emotional armor he once wore so proudly starts to feel heavier. You see, the masculine ego often finds comfort in walls. Emotional detachment, stoicism, control. It's all part of a defense mechanism shaped by conditioning, by pride, by the need to avoid vulnerability at all costs. Vulnerability in his world might have once equaled weakness. He learnt to hold it back, to deflect with humor, anger, or silence. But here's where the paradox begins. Your silence, when rooted in self-worth rather than spite, becomes the very mirror that reflects the hollowness of those defenses. It's in your absence that his own emotional state starts to come into focus. Before, when you were available, texting, reaching out, explaining yourself, giving him your heart again and again, he could remain emotionally closed off without consequence. There was no pressure to open up, no need to examine himself. You carried the emotional load. But silence puts it all back in his hands, and most aren't ready for that weight. The mind, in silence, doesn't just reflect on others, it turns inward. And when he sits with his thoughts long enough, without distraction, without the comfort of your attention, the emotional cracks begin to show. Not because you made him feel broken, but because your absence illuminated what he'd been avoiding. The unresolved wounds, the unmet emotional needs, the false sense of power that came from never being fully present in the relationship. What's powerful here is the timing. It's not immediate, it's not dramatic, it's subtle, psychological erosion. The walls don't fall all at once. They wear down, day by day, thought by thought, a picture, a memory, a realization. And eventually, the silence he once found convenient starts to echo with discomfort. It becomes the space where he hears his own voice more clearly, and sometimes for the first time, honestly. Without the noise of your energy buffering his emotions, he starts to feel, not just about you, but about himself. And often what he feels isn't strength, it's the weight of everything he hasn't said, hasn't faced, hasn't healed. Because here's the thing, when someone is emotionally blocked, they're not just blocked with you, they're blocked within themselves. Your silence doesn't hurt them, it confronts them. And that confrontation can't be avoided forever. The human psyche is wired for coherence. When our external world doesn't match our internal truth, discomfort rises. And for a man who's told himself he doesn't care, that he's fine, that you were too much or too emotional, he will start to notice that his internal state is no longer aligned with those beliefs. He'll notice a tension, a dissonance, and that dissonance will push him to begin feeling again what he thought was strength. His ability to detach, to withhold affection, to stay emotionally in control, starts to feel like a barrier. And that barrier now separates him from the one thing he's starting to crave, connection. Not just with you, but with a part of himself he had long suppressed. You may never see it, he may never admit it, but it's there, the breaking down of emotional rigidity, the subtle softening, the growing awareness that his walls didn't protect him, they imprisoned him. And now, the very silence he once welcomed has become the loudest teacher in the room. This is where growth begins, in discomfort, in realization, in the quiet collapse of everything the ego once clung to. And you didn't force it, you didn't demand it, you allowed it by stepping back, by letting go, by choosing your peace over your need to be understood. That choice becomes a catalyst, not just for your own transformation, but for his as well. Because silence, when rooted in love for yourself, is not a punishment, it's an invitation for him to meet himself in the places he's been avoiding, an invitation for him to choose presence over performance, depth over distance. And whether he takes that invitation or not is his path. But know this, your silence may be the first sound he truly hears, and in hearing it, he might finally learn what it means to feel There's a strange shift that happens when someone who once took your energy for granted is suddenly faced with the void of your absence. That absence becomes a trigger, not just of longing or curiosity, but of confrontation, not with you, but with himself. When you go silent, when you stop trying to explain, to fix, to remind him of your worth, something deep in the subconscious gets activated, and that something is shame. Not guilt. Shame. There's a difference. Guilt is about what you did. Shame is about who you are. And when a man begins to recognize, perhaps for the first time, that he mishandled something sacred, your vulnerability, your consistency, your emotional generosity, shame creeps in through the cracks. And unlike guilt, which can sometimes be soothed with an apology, shame demands something more. It demands a reckoning. At first, it may not look like shame at all. It might appear as avoidance, distraction, blame. He might double down on false narratives or convince himself that you overreacted, that you were too sensitive, too emotional. But that's a defense, because facing the truth that he had access to something rare and treated it casually requires a level of emotional maturity that most people haven't developed yet, especially those who've never had to face real consequences for emotional negligence. The mind tries to make sense of this discomfort, and when silence is sustained, not used as a game, but as a form of healing and self-preservation, it strips away the noise. No more back and forth, no more texting wars, no more emotional labor to cushion his ego. Now there's just him and the memory of what was. And in that memory, if he's honest, he starts to see where he chose self-protection over connection, where he dismissed the very presence that was holding space for his growth. He remembers the moments he left you on read, the times you cried and he stayed silent, the invitations he ignored, the love he deflected. He begins to recall not only your beauty and kindness, but how, in his wounded masculinity, he couldn't fully receive it. And that's where the shame blooms. Not because you made him feel small, but because he made himself smaller by pushing away something expansive. What's important to understand here is that shame isn't inherently destructive. In fact, it can be alchemical if it's acknowledged, because shame at its core is a signal. It tells us we've acted out of alignment with our higher self. It points to where our character didn't match our potential. And when we are willing to look at that, not run from it, not numb it, but actually face it, it can catalyze profound transformation. But here's the paradox. Your silence becomes the mirror, not your words, not your efforts, your absence. Because when someone sees who they became when you were present and who they are now without you, they can't escape the comparison. And it forces a deeper question. Was I really the version of myself I claimed to be? Most people don't ask that question unless life or silence demands it. And when they finally do, the answers can be sobering, because they begin to realize that what they dismissed wasn't just a person, it was an opportunity to rise, to grow, to love in a way that was unfamiliar but deeply necessary. And this is why your silence isn't just the end of the conversation, it's the beginning of his internal dialogue, a dialogue he can't mute, one that replays in quiet moments, in the late night thoughts, in the spaces where distraction no longer works. It's not punishment, it's a pause, a sacred one. And in that pause, shame may speak, softly at first, then louder. And if he's brave, he'll listen. He'll see that what he thought was just another chapter was, in fact, the turning point. You see, we teach people how to treat us not only through our boundaries, but through our absence. Because our energy is not free. It's earned through reciprocity, through respect, through emotional presence. And when you reclaim that energy, not with rage, but with reverence, you send a powerful message. I am no longer available for the version of you that couldn't see me. So let him sit with the shame, not because you want him to suffer, but because you want him to evolve. And maybe, just maybe, he will. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to walk away with dignity, leaving behind only the truth and the silence to hear it. And then comes the sixth layer of this silent unraveling, the realization that he's lost something he cannot replace. Not because you were perfect, not because you never made mistakes, but because the space you held in his life was unique, singular, energetically rare. And when someone has spent so long taking that kind of presence for granted, the absence doesn't just feel empty, it feels irreversible. You see, there's a point where the ego can no longer protect him from the truth, where every attempt to rationalize, to reframe, to project blame onto you begins to fall flat. The mind may say, I'm fine, I didn't need her anyway, but the nervous system tells a different story. The soul, quiet, often buried under distractions and bravado, starts to whisper a deeper truth. You messed up. You let something sacred slip through your fingers. This is the moment where reality begins to settle in. When you go silent, especially with no theatrical exit, no grand declaration of revenge or closure, you create a vacuum of energetic clarity. And in that vacuum, what's left is undeniable. He starts to compare, not just you to others, but how he felt when he was with you versus how he feels now. It's often not the person that people miss. It's the version of themselves they had access to through that person. That feeling of being seen, challenged, softened, or inspired. And that realization doesn't always come in some dramatic aha moment. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor at sunset, quiet, certain, and impossible to stop. Maybe it hits him when he tries to recreate the connection with someone else and feels nothing, or when he hears a song, smells your perfume, or stumbles across an old photo. The past starts to feel closer than the present, and no distraction, no party, no new fling, no new goal can replicate that frequency. And this is where the soul begins to feel the weight of misalignment. It's not just regret. It's a kind of spiritual reckoning, a confrontation with the deeper self that says, you were given a chance to rise and you stayed small. This isn't about romantic loss. It's about self-abandonment. Because when someone loses you after you've poured into them, held space for them, offered them healing they didn't even know they needed, what they actually lost was access to their higher path. And for some, that moment becomes a fork in the road. Evolve or repeat. But here's what's even more profound. The version of you that he now misses, she doesn't even exist anymore, not in the same form, because while he was avoiding the silence, you were transmuting it. You were turning it into wisdom, into boundaries, into new standards. You weren't just grieving, you were evolving. You became the version of you that no longer needs to be chosen, the version that chooses herself. And that's something he will feel, even if he can't explain it. We are all energetic beings, and whether someone is deeply spiritual or not, they can sense when they no longer have access to your essence, when the door isn't just closed, it's locked, not out of bitterness, but out of reverence, because some energy is too sacred to offer twice. This is the part he doesn't expect. He thought you'd always be there. Maybe not always physically, but emotionally, in the background, ready to answer, willing to reconsider. And when he finally reaches out or thinks about reaching out, he can feel that something is gone, that your energy has shifted, that the woman who once bent to meet him where he was has now risen so far that meeting her requires him to climb. This is the soul lesson, not just for him, but for you, that love is not measured by how long you wait. It's measured by how deeply you honor yourself in the waiting. That silence is not emptiness, it's alignment. And that your worth is not determined by how much someone regrets losing you, but by how powerfully you embody your own return. When your silence becomes louder than your presence ever was, the soul hears what the ego never could. And in that moment, the lesson becomes the